This morning, President Trump gave an update on Iran's missile strikes on American air bases in Iraq. Here's what he had to say.
As long as I'm President of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. At my direction, the United States military eliminated the world's top terrorist, Qasem Soleimani. As the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani was personally responsible for some of the absolutely worst atrocities. He trained terrorist armies, including Hezbollah, launching terrorist strikes against civilian targets. He fueled bloody civil wars all across the region. He viciously wounded and murdered thousands of U.S. troops, including the planting of roadside bombs that maim and dismember their victims. Soleimani directed the recent attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq that badly wounded 4 service members and killed 1 American, and he orchestrated the violent assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Soleimani's hands were drenched in both American and Iranian blood. He should have been terminated long ago. By removing Soleimani, we have sent a powerful message to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our people. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior. In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters, fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia, and shot down 2 U.S. drones. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013, and they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration. The regime also greatly tightened the reins on their own country, even recently killing 1,500 people at the many protests that are taking place all throughout Iran. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. They must now break away from the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. We must also make a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper and take advantage of its enormous untapped potential. Iran can be a great country. Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war. The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward. Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America has achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities. These are accomplishments that nobody thought were possible. And options in the Middle East became available. We are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way. He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran, we want you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve, one of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. President, why would we negotiate with you, sir? Mr. President, how about you well?
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and CIA Director Gina Haspel went to Capitol Hill today to give Congress a classified briefing on Iran. Some lawmakers spoke to reporters as they exited the closed-door meeting.
I'm not the expert here. They're now doing a Q&A for members.
You didn't have any cues?
Well, normally that's a same questions from most members.
How was the briefing?
Well, it's probably the strongest and most decisive briefing that has ever been conducted in that classified setting. Having attended a number of these, the information that was shared was both compelling and decisive. I think it leaves little doubt in my mind, and certainly should leave little doubt in any member's mind, that not only did the president make the right call, but that this was a clear and present danger for American interest and American individuals.
Did you get any answers on this imminent threat that officials had talked about after the initial strike?
Obviously, we can't talk about what happened in a classified setting, but I can, in general terms, indicate that our intelligence agencies, both Director Haspel probably gave the greatest breadth of information that was not only compelling, but certainly exhaustive in terms of the number of attacks and planned attacks that have been contemplated, and why the need for action was necessitated.
Does it sound like the situation is de-escalating?
Yeah, I think based on the president's speech today, and certainly based on the intelligence that does not come from this classified setting, I would say that I'm optimistic that we can look at a de-escalating environment. However, I think it's important for us to share that this is the #1 state sponsor of terror, to suggest that there are not rogue actors and not people that could potentially be in harm's way would be certainly inappropriate to draw those conclusions. At the same time, I think it's a good day for America, because we know that indeed American interests were protected, but hopefully avoiding a war and a long, protracted engagement in the Middle East.
With the president overnight.
Yeah. I don't normally comment on conversations I may or may not have with the president. Yeah.
The U.S. was facing?
Obviously, getting into specifics would be violating what we can't talk about, but I can say this, that Director Haspel was very clear and very articulate, and the numerous examples that she shared, and I think that the American people can rest easier tonight knowing that not only the President of the United States is in the Oval Office, but he has an incredible team around him working around the clock to make sure that those potential attacks are addressed in real time.
Would you,
The U.S. is no longer facing those threats, that Soleimani is dead?
Well, I think it's a general opinion, having served on the Middle East subcommittee for 3 terms and understanding the Middle East as well as a number of my colleagues. It is a complex region. It's always a complex region, but this general's absence will not be easily replaced, and certainly would have some of his directional and organizational abilities that will take months, if not years, to replace.
Since the strike, the Iranian government has thrown off restrictions on enriching uranium.
Yeah.
Well,
they were already doing that. I think the best way to say that is now they're announcing that they're not complying with a joint agreement that they never complied with to begin with. And so to suggest that somehow this was a decisive moment for them not to comply with uranium enrichment is just not factually correct. I had doubts about the agreement when it was negotiated originally, and if you look back during the Obama administration, even within months, there were certain non-compliance issues under that agreement, and they've gotten progressively worse.
Congressman, would you have supported a different response than the sanctions President Trump announced today?
I think he's actually made the very right call, and certainly I was not in the room to ascertain or assess all the intelligence that he was privy to. But I think based on what I just heard, I think that not only did he make the right call, but it was the right call at the right time with exactly the right amount of emphasis.
So the president says he wants a new nuclear deal with Iran. Do you think that we're closer to that today than we were?
I don't know that we've ever been close to a nuclear deal with Iran. I mean, the #1 state sponsor of terror. And I mean, but what I do know is the same individuals that negotiated with North Korea, who now have a nuclear capability, are the same ones who negotiated this previous deal. And I can tell you that having a different outcome with the same negotiators based on the same set of circumstances is not something that normally bodes well for America.
Did they discuss the legal basis for the strike?
I beg your pardon?
Did they discuss the legal basis for the strike?
Yes, the legal basis was a question. The first question was asked by the chairman, Smith, and that was addressed immediately. The War Powers resolution that we're talking about, I think it's the inappropriate time to have a discussion. As many of you know, I've been one that has been very willing to look at the authorization for use of military force and have a real robust debate about that. You don't have a debate about that in the middle of conflict, and certainly to question whether the president has legal authority. There's no doubt that he has legal authority. Not only was a conflict, did it happen in Iraq, of which we do have an existing AUMF that is country specific, but certainly under the Constitution and other powers that are outlined in the War Powers Act, he has a number of legal opportunities to actually engage.
Who explained the legal justification?
Yeah, I don't want to get into specifics, but obviously it was somebody from DOJ. Yeah.
What would the next steps from Congress be?
Yeah, I think that the next step for Congress should be that we understand that the world is a safer place because one bad terrorist that had the ability to organize strategic strikes in the region is no longer with us and has been taken out. And to come together and find a way to look at being able to empower every administration, not just this administration or the previous administration, but every administration to go after terrorists where they are, and yet at the same time understand that really long engagements, prolonged engagements with boots on the ground is something that is a constitutional requirement of Congress, and I'm all about making sure that we maintain that. But certainly when you're talking about specific strikes, you have to give tactical flexibility to the administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Congressman.
Willingness to exercise profound restraint.
Do you feel like they are the administration's right
I have yet to see this president exercise restraint on anything.
Did their briefing give you
Congressman-
confidence in the administration's
Real brief,
long-term
yeah.
strategy?
Congressman, again, can you characterize sort of your general, what your, I think you call it your impressions? I know you don't talk to specifics of the briefing.
Without commenting on content, my reaction to this briefing was it was sophomoric and utterly unconvincing. And I believe more than ever, the Congress needs to act to protect the constitutional provisions about war and peace.
What can you say about the rationale for the strike on Soleimani and also the idea of whether there were imminent threats?
I believe there was no rationale that could pass a graduate school thesis test. I was, well, utterly unpersuaded about any evidence about the imminence of a threat that was new or compelling.
The legal rationale that was delivered to you, is that
The legal rationale absolutely fell in the category of sophomoric. The citation was Article 2 of the Constitution and the 2002 AUMF authorization for the use of military force, which of course had nothing to do with Iran. It had to do with what happened after 9/11.
The administration contend that does not need a new AUMF.
Again, I won't comment on content of the briefing because that's classified, but I think the fact that they cited the old one as sufficient would suggest they don't feel they need a new one.
The administration seems to be arguing that the 2002 AUMF says threats from Iran. This was tailored to
I think that's a very thin reed in which to now be arguing in favor of potentially an entire new military initiative that ultimately has as its target Iran.
Do you think war powers legislation should repeal the 2002?
I believe that's an absolute necessary first step, and today just proved it. The fact that the administration is still citing a 17-year-old AUMF that applied to a totally different set of circumstances ought to be a cause of concern for all members of Congress.
Mr. Carley, given that the threat of military escalation at the moment seems to be gone, and Soleimani is dead now, is this in any way a validation of the Trump strategy?
As I said earlier, I believe that the threat of retaliation has only begun. I don't believe it's evaporated at all. There is the military retaliation that occurred yesterday and tonight, and that may be ongoing or may not. But then there's the cyber attacks that we're probably likely to face for an indefinite period of time. And then there's the whole Hezbollah network that also lost leadership that has yet to be heard from. So I wouldn't rest easy that somehow the threat is contained and that's the end of it. I don't believe that's true at all.
What about next steps for
Unfortunately.
the administration? Do you think the administration has a plan going forward?
I believe this administration is after the fact trying to piece together a rationale for its action that was impulsive, reckless, and put this country's security at risk. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're satisfied that there were rules?
Yeah, you want to answer that? Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to go first? Yeah, you go. You want me to go first? You go ahead. Okay. Yeah, afternoon. Obviously, we can't share specifically what was talked about in the classified hearing, but we can continue to talk about some of the things that we've been trying to make the point with Soleimani, why it was imminent at the time when you have him in Baghdad, Iraq. Here's the Iranian general in Baghdad, Iraq, meeting with the mobilization forces, Mohammed Rida, specifically talking about and discussing potentially another embassy attack. That's when we felt like it was imminent, and that's why we are supportive of the president's strike. And I'll turn it over to my colleague from the Intelligence Committee if he has any.
Yeah, Congressman Stewart, again, I sit on the House Intelligence Committee. We've been tracking this actually for the last few months. I can tell you that many of us drew the conclusion before we went home for Christmas that something like this was inevitable. As they've accelerated and they've expanded their aggressive behavior there, as they continue to attack facilities like the Baghdad International Hotel, or I'm sorry, airport, where there are hundreds of Americans, you can't attack those facilities and not eventually kill American soldiers or American contractors. And the president has sent the sign to them very clearly since the nefarious activity last fall. If you kill Americans, that changes things for us. And that's what happened here. Again, the intelligence was very, very clear that that was going to continue to be the case, and probably on a much more dramatic scale, and the president felt compelled that he had to act. And I think he did exactly the appropriate thing.
Yep.
Did you hear, Congressman, intelligence that indicated imminent attack within days or weeks? Because what you're describing just sounds like what has been his behavior for the past few years, traveling through the region, meeting with the proxies.
We have to speak very careful on this, but I can tell you with assurance that this was not the same thing we've been seeing for the past few years. This was something different.
Can you respond to the Democrats talking about doing some sort of war powers resolution to constrain the president?
Yeah, I think that's ridiculous at this moment to be able to pursue that. My same Democratic colleagues, many of them were here, sit on the floor with me when we supported President Obama. He killed 3,000 plus terrorist attacks. Nobody was wanting to change the rules then or call for any kind of War Powers Act. Now, where they did agree with us on the House floor, I think 19 of them voted with Republicans to push back on the Iranian agreement. One of the two things that President Obama came to the House to lobby on, because they understood what exactly has transpired, that hundreds of millions of dollars would be funneled down to groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and we saw that money being used to attack our embassy. We hope that America is chosen over terrorism by all of our party groups, and I hope this will be a unifying event that we stand certainly in resolve to go after anybody that wakes up every day wishing to do Israel and America harm. Thank you.
And I just got to elaborate on that quickly, and that is, I would challenge any of my colleagues, regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, to describe to me any difference between what the president did in the last few days and what President Obama did for his entire administration. There were thousands of drone attacks in Iraq that killed, including surely other than Iraqis, including Shia militia. And again, if you think this requires a war powers authorization, then tell us what is different now from what we experienced for 8 years in the preceding period. So, thank you.
Thank you, yes.
We reacted appropriately. I guess I'll say a few things here, but. I thought the briefing was very helpful to have the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the other intelligence officials really walk through just how long of a history Soleimani had of inflicting terror and murder for not only to Americans but to others, our allies in the region. And the fact that he was plotting further attacks to kill Americans made it clear that it was time to take him out. A real question I would ask would be, is the world a safer place without Soleimani in it? And based on his own history as a terrorist, but also the things he was plotting against Americans in the future, the clear answer is yes, the world is a safer place with Soleimani gone. And so the intelligence was laid out, not only why, but what the justification was. Obviously, there's a clear legal authority in the AUMF going back to 2002, where the president has the ability to take action against terrorists in Iraq. President Obama used that authority, which we supported. President Trump used that authority to take out Soleimani. Again, an identified terrorist, the head of an international terrorist organization, and he was in Iraq plotting further attacks against Americans with other heads of terrorist organizations. So I think it was very helpful to have this intelligence briefing, clearly a packed house of members, both Republican and Democrat, that came to hear the intelligence and also to ask their questions. And I thought it was a very informative briefing.
Can you react to Democrats wanting to put forward legislation constraining the president and Iran or some sort of resolution?
Well, first of all, I think it would be a mistake for Democrats to try to retort some of the Iranian talking points to criticize the president when Soleimani was known by everybody to be a bloody terrorist. This was a brutal terrorist who had been directly responsible for hundreds of American lives, was plotting attacks against more Americans at the time. Now, if they want to have a full debate on the 2002 AUMF, that's been going on in Congress for a long time, but that was passed before I came here and before many of our colleagues came to Congress, and it gives the president clear authority to take action. It's always fair for Congress to debate whether or not that law needs to be revised, but it's a clear legal authority. But any time, especially when we're in the middle of actions by Iran against America, we should all be coming together to support our commander-in-chief to protect America, not debating how to limit the president's ability to defend this country. And so I think the president took the very appropriate action at taking out Soleimani and has got a very clear plan to protect Americans, not only here in America, but also in bases in Iraq and all around the world.
Democrats have been saying that the officials do not provide any specific information about what the imminent threat was involving Soleimani that rises beyond what he's been doing for the last several years. Were you satisfied that there was some sort of imminent threat? And did you get enough details to explain it?
Well, clearly there is a lot of documented information about the kind of attacks Soleimani plotted and executed against Americans, killing American service members, killing other Americans, kidnapping people. But he was also plotting future attacks. And obviously, you can't go into full detail about the intelligence of those future attacks. But how much is enough? How many more Americans did Soleimani need to kill before somebody's going to support him finally being taken out and removed from this planet? And so again, I would go back to my basic question is the world a safer place with Soleimani not in it? And the clear answer is yes. Thank you.
What I heard was a very unpersuasive short discussion of why to act now and the imminent threats. What I didn't hear at all was any justification of this action in terms of our long-term policy. Soleimani has been responsible for conventional attacks. There's blood on his hands. But the real goal is to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. The strategy that the president employs is his maximum pressure campaign. What is the purpose of that? It is to convince the Iranian people not to put up with the deprivations being caused by our sanctions and to demand either a change in Iranian government policy or a change in who's making that policy. What our action did this week is make Soleimani a martyr. Made him a martyr in front of a Shiite population, a Shiite sect which lionizes martyrdom and is based in large part on the martyrdom of Imam Hussein many hundreds of years ago. The effect of this action, as far as there was no explanation as to how this action will not make the Iranian people willing to absorb whatever deprivations we impose and allow the Iranian government to continue its nuclear weapons program. I think there was some short-term thinking in the actions of the president. Thank you.
Okay.
Congressman, what did you think of the briefing?
Well, the briefings were, of course, I can't tell you a lot about the briefings because it's classified, but the basic theme of it was the administration essentially saying, trust us. And that's really what it all boils down to. I'm not sure who I trust or what I trust when it comes to these issues, because we've been told so many different things that really just bother me. One of the things that I know a lot of people are very unhappy with is the AUMF back in 2001, 2002. If this is justification for having more hostilities, we're essentially reopening the Iraq War again. And I think a lot of us feel very uncomfortable with that. So there are lots of unanswered questions. Again, some of them I cannot discuss with you, but I'm not sure that trust me is the satisfactory answer for me.
So what
Thank you.
legislation are you backing at this point?
No, we haven't. We're going to sit down and put our heads together and figure out what we are doing. But the Foreign Affairs Committee is going to hold hearings next week to try to get to the bottom of this. We've invited Secretary Pompeo to come. I hope he does. If he doesn't, we're going to go along with the hearing anyway, because the American people have the right to know.
Do you intend to subpoena him if he doesn't attend?
It's a possibility. We haven't made any decision on that.
After hearing what you heard today in the briefing, do you think that the strike was justified, and do you think that there was an imminent threat?
Well, we're told there was an imminent threat. I'm not sure I'm convinced about that. Look, the person we took out is no sweetheart, and was no fan of his, and I'm no fan of the Iranian regime. The question is, do we want to get sucked into another war? The past 20 years or so, we've been really preoccupied with war after war, and I'm not convinced that this is any different, or much different than what we've experienced for the past 20 years. And if we're using the old AUMFs to continue to do this, then what we're really saying is we have perpetual war that's never going to end. And that is certainly not acceptable to me, and I think to the majority of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle.
Were you satisfied with the president's speech today? Did you feel like he was kind of stepping back a little bit?
It's hard to say. I mean, I have questions. We have questions. I don't think our questions are really being answered. So, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you believe that information should be declassified so the American people get more of these questions?
Please. Sorry, live view. Yeah, it's geared subway, yeah.
I'm very shy. I don't like public speaking, but fine, we'll do it.
Your impressions of what you heard today?
It was very well done. I think they've done an excellent job of outlining the rationale behind both the decision to go after Soleimani and the response to the Iranian attack yesterday. So it was very well done.
Are give you information on the specific threat?
Well, we've been monitoring this, at least on the Intelligence Committee, and those of us who follow this issue for more than 9 months. Last year alone, I think you've seen an over 200% increase in Iraqi and Iranian proxy attacks against the United States and its interests. Just in the last few months, you've seen an increase not just in volume, but you've seen an increase in the types of weapons they're using, their lethality. You've seen clear intelligence that they were about to ratchet it up even further, and that there was a near-term threat against American troops stationed abroad. And I'll tell you this, I am convinced that had decisive action not been taken, we could very well be standing here today talking about the death of dozens, if not hundreds of Americans at the hands of Shia militias working as proxies for the Iranian regime.
Was there discussion about sharing any of that with the American public?
Not only am I convinced that there was a near-term threat, but that there's an ongoing near-term threat. It exists today, but it really existed back in the last 2 months of this year. It's been ongoing for a while. Again, just in the last year, we have seen an increasing willingness to not just directly engage the United States, but to inflict casualties and deaths on American troops. That is a line they were increasingly willing to cross. And that converged with all sorts of other intelligence, which I can't discuss, that I think led to the very reasonable conclusion that if decisive action was not taken, not only would those attacks occur and Americans would die, but that we would have lost all deterrence balance against the Iranians and the decisions they're making in the region.
Should the administration share some of this intelligence to make the case publicly to the American people?
Listen, I wish we could. The problem is, it's not that you try to keep secrets from people so you know something they don't. It's that if you share this intelligence, it will not take more than 10 seconds for others to realize where it came from. And not only will we lose that intelligence stream, we'd put partnerships, lives, and methods in danger. And understand that these intelligence streams that provide this information for us aren't just a value in the past, they're a value in the future in terms of disrupting future plots or understanding future intentions. So you cannot risk that, and that's the rationale for why some of it can't be publicly disclosed.
Did the president's address today diffuse, de-escalate tensions?
Look, I think the president appropriately responded. He didn't respond last night. He waited for the full assessment of what the attack, the damage it had done, or the damage it did not do, no casualties to us or to our allies. And I think he's responded at this point appropriately to it. And I think one of the key elements I would point to is that Iran is using the very ballistic missiles that and I think he made this point himself, that the Iran deal helped finance in terms of not just the cash that's provided, but the economic activity that allows them. I mean, how do they pay for all these Shia groups and the weapons they're providing for them? They're getting the money from somewhere. And even now, their economy under tremendous strain continues to fund these things. You can only imagine with lifting of sanctions, they had revenue at their disposal, not to mention cash delivered by the U.S. government, that they were able to divert to improving their long-range missile capabilities, but also to improving their ability to provide this weaponry to Shia militias, who in turn were using it to target Americans and our allies.
The White House is saying that part of the cash and part of the funding that helped Iran have these strikes came from the Obama administration. They're blaming it actually on the predecessor of President Trump. Do you agree with that assertion?
I don't think there's any dispute. There can't be any doubt that the Iran deal allowed Iran to generate more revenue, both from commercial activity, but also that there was cash delivered to them. There's no dispute. I mean, those are facts. It's the reason why Iran is so upset about the sanctions now. It's hurting their economy. And so, what did they didn't spend that money on bridges, roads, and infrastructure, and they're spending a lot of money. These foreign adventurisms that they're undertaking, whether it's Lebanese Hezbollah or the Hezbollah groups that exist inside of Syria, whether it's Palestinian Jihad, whether it's the Hezbollah groups that exist there, and the other Shia militias that exist in Iraq, all of these groups cost money. They are increasingly equipped with advanced weaponry that none of them, you can't buy it at Walmart, and none of them know how to make it. It's being provided by the Iranians. And that costs money. Where's that money coming from?
Part of that deal was freezing money and giving Iran back the money that it had. The way that the Trump administration is saying, and the president himself is saying, that President Obama gave them cash. Do you agree with that assertion?
Well, irrespective of the origins of the money and the fact that it had been frozen, it was cash. And that cash was used. And if you look at what they spend money on, they spend money on sponsoring terrorists, and they spend money on developing ballistic missiles. So I think it's absolutely fair to say that the Iran deal helped finance the capabilities they now have to launch those missiles yesterday, and the capabilities they have to target Americans using proxy groups that they believe provides them deniability. And that risk still exists. I think what's changed is they understand that when this president says if an American is killed, there's going to be a response, it's not some talking point or a tweet. It's real because of the death of Soleimani.
Senator, do you see any role for Congress at this point, legislative or otherwise?
Well, first of all, I think any help that they need in terms of continuing to ensure that we pass spending here that allows our military to have the capabilities to respond is important. I think consultations like this with Congress are also very important in terms of input that we may have and advice that we might be able to give. But if you're referring to an AUMF, that is silly. It is ridiculous. You do not need, first of all, we don't need an AUMF to react defensively. And that this administration is not talking about invading Iran or starting another Gulf War or massive troop deployments for a massive and extended deployment inside the territory of Iran or anything of that nature. It is talking about what it will do if we are attacked. That is called self-defense. And every president is authorized by the Constitution of the United States, not just authorized, but required to protect the United States, and particularly our men and women when we deploy them abroad. Number two, he is particularly compelled to do so when the men and women who we are protecting are deployed in Iraq under a congressional authorization. The troops that are in Iraq are there under a congressional authorization that was passed that allows them and authorizes for them to be there. But we never need congressional authority in this country to act in the defense of our troops. And that's what this administration has done. They have been very clear they don't seek to start a war. And if there is military action, it will be in response to Iranian or proxy actions, not because we started it first.
Senator, what do you say to your Democratic colleagues who say they don't see what the long-term strategy is? They, regardless of what has happened over the last 24, 48 hours, where do they say that they don't have evidence of what the president wants to do to solve the Iran problem over the long run?
I don't know where they're looking, because I can tell you that it's pretty apparent what the strategy is, and that is that Iran needs to abandon any sort of nuclear weapons ambitions. It needs to stop sponsoring terrorist groups, and it needs to stop developing ballistic and long-range missiles. And if it does those three things...
How do you get there, I guess?
Well, I think, guys, that's one of the reasons why we have relied on economic pressure. And you saw the president outline today the hope that other nations, particularly signatories to the JCPOA, would join in that effort. I think the strike alone points to why any future Iran deal must include ballistic missiles and the sponsorship of terrorism. I think that's the strategy. It's not a very complicated one. We want Iran to act like a normal country. All right?
What was the specific tripwire that triggered Friday night's attack on Soleimani? I don't guess that's Sorry, I was trying to tell this. We had the, you guys were out the live view. We were trying to tell where to go.
Y'all ready? So we had a good briefing that I think did address both the issues of imminence of threat and opportunity to take out a mastermind of terror that was the top terrorist operative for the #1 state sponsor of terror, Iran. Every member of the Senate, I'm on the Intel Committee, but every member of the Senate has had access since I think late May to a book of activities specifically related to this person and the rising tempo and intensity of what Soleimani was willing to do, was doing, and in the number of attacks all over the world, his relationship with the Houthi, his relationship with Hezbollah, his relationship with Syria. Pretty unusual that we would have that kind of focus and encourage the time to look at that kind of focus on one individual, and I thought it was a good briefing.
You mentioned a lot of activity from Soleimani from months and years past. Were you convinced that there was this imminent threat that required urgent action last week?
And I think we had a sense in today's briefing that they were confident that his activities were likely to come to a significant head within days of the day he was killed. One question earlier from somebody else was, well, this person's been running the Quds Force for a long time. Why was he of a greater danger than he was 3 years ago or 5 years ago? And let me go back to the encouragement of every senator to look at his activities starting in the late spring of this year. That was a different level of activity and a different willingness to take risk and engage in ways that Americans could lose life than we had seen from Soleimani before or from the Iranians in a while. Thank you all.
Hello. As I've long said, and you've heard me say for years, if Iran wanted to start a fight, the United States could end it, and that's exactly what happened over the last 10 days. Qasem Soleimani was Iran's terrorist mastermind, responsible for the death of thousands of Americans. He deserved exactly what he got, and America and the world is now safer because of it.
Senator, how would you characterize the attack that the Iranians leveled back at us last night?
A feckless and anemic attack.
And what's your response to the president's address today? Did he de-escalate?
Iran de-escalated. Iran didn't just take an off-ramp, they took a U-turn because they know they have no capability to fight against America, a technologically superior adversary. They also know that we will no longer allow them deniability if they try to use their terrorist proxies throughout the region. If a single American is harmed, as the president has long said, they will face severe consequences. That's what happened on December 27th, and the consequences they faced were severe. Thank you all.
Thanks.
All I will say is this. It is a far cry from meeting a standard of imminent threat. They had to leave pretty quickly, so about 10 of the attending senators, 10 to 15, got to ask questions, and many others did not get to ask questions, but at least based on the presentation that was made, it does not meet what I consider to be an imminent threat.
How do you think the administration should tomorrow? Do you have a comment?
Senator Menendez.
Senator Menendez.
I went into this briefing today. With some critical questions that I wanted to hear the answers to. The imminency of the threat, the nature of the threat, the intelligence that would lead us to understand that eliminating Soleimani alone would eliminate the threat. And I walk away not only unsatisfied, but it draws real concerns for me that we do not have the type of information that is critical for members of the United States Senate to make.
Secretary.
Don't feel too bad. That's what they did to us as well. They closed the briefing rather quickly. So, anyhow, we have more questions than we have answers at the end of the day.
Just a quick, I'm Tom Carper, Delaware. Just a quick history lesson. 5 or 6 years ago, the idea came up, well, why don't we try to negotiate a deal to reduce the likelihood that Iran will develop nuclear weapons. Some folks in this body thought that was a bad idea. Actually, some folks in Iran thought that was a bad idea. They thought that they should not engage with us. But they did, and we reached an agreement. An agreement called the JCPOA. It worked. Among the people in Iran who thought it was a bad idea, who thought they should not negotiate the JCPOA, was Soleimani. They thought it was a bad idea to negotiate, a bad idea to actually enter into that agreement. You know what happened with that agreement? Iran kept the agreement. 17 rounds of inspections, 17, no, they kept their word. There were elections 3 years ago. You know what happened in those elections? The moderates swept the field. Elections, city councils, mayors, the parliament. Today, the moderates have been diminished. And you know who's been raised up? The radicals, the Ayatollah, people like Soleimani. That is not a victory. At least that's not the kind of victory I think we want.
So, Senator Murphy, Senator Merkley, and I, and others, we just want to make a few comments about our takeaway from this briefing. You know, we can read about the judgments administration officials make in the newspapers and in the media. These intelligence briefings are supposed to focus on facts behind the judgments, so we can make an independent evaluation of the judgments that are being made. And I would say that the briefing was incredibly thin on facts, and to the extent that they provided facts, in my judgment, they did not support any claim of an imminent threat that would justify the actions they've taken with respect to eliminating Soleimani. And it's important that you have that justification. It was one they gave. I did notice in President Trump's remarks at the White House today, he mentioned that they were engaged in planning attacks. The president himself didn't use the word imminent this morning at the White House. And it's an important distinction because I just want to everyone to think about this. We're engaged in a very very tense situation with Iran, even before the latest actions. The United States military plans what targets it will hit under certain circumstances. It's not surprising that the Iranians will also determine what targets they may hit if they are attacked by the Americans. So the idea that people might be planning to take certain actions is not surprising, just as we plan to take certain actions under certain circumstances. So the takeaway from my perspective is that they did not establish in any way the facts that would support the claim of an imminent threat that was posed, meaning that someone had decided to attack U.S. forces and kill lots of Americans. Let me turn it over to Senator Murphy.
Yeah, let me concur with Senator Van Hollen's analysis. I was deeply surprised at the lack of information presented by the administration regarding a specific imminent threat. This appears to me to be a strike of choice by this administration, one that likely would have required congressional authorization beforehand. The consequences of this strike already in the first 6 days have been cataclysmic. Our troops are being pushed out of Iraq. Iran has started its nuclear weapons program again. All counter-ISIL operations have been halted. There are serious political consequences to the decision that was made. And we did not get information inside that briefing that there was a specific imminent threat that we were halting through the operation conducted last Thursday night. And I can say I was, I think, both surprised and saddened to not have that information before us. I think it is likely because it doesn't exist. But the fullness of the briefing is complicated by the fact that it only lasted 75 minutes. After waiting 6 days, the administration barely gave 100 senators an hour. We left with multiple important questions that were still unanswered. And I frankly think it's not just unacceptable to not present intelligence, if it exists, but it's also not sufficient to give the United States Senate just over an hour of time to explain a military action that likely has grave long-term consequences for our security.
I'm just going to say one thing and then let my colleagues take over. There were so many important questions that they did not answer. We did not see a plan, a satisfying plan for the future. We had 97 senators there. 15 got to ask questions. As the questions began to get tough, they walked out. I've asked for a commitment that they all come back within a week. We have not yet gotten that commitment. Thank you. I'll resume.
One of the things that was very troubling is there was no indication that there was due thought given to the consequences of the action. Before the action against Soleimani, we had massive protests in Iran against the Iranian government, and now we have massive protests against the U.S. No clarity that this was understood how it would affect the unity for the radicals and undermine the moderates in Iran. No sense that they had considered that the fact of an attack in Iraq without the permission of the Iraqi government would undermine the authority of the Iraqi government, which had a formal relationship with the militias. No sense that they would interrupt, if you will, the training of the troops who are taking on ISIS. No sense of how this would impact the increase in nuclear refinement being done, enrichment being done by Iraq. No sense that they had considered how this would put the assets of our allies at risk. In fact, quite frankly, there was no presentation at all of a comprehensive understanding of how the consequences might hurt all of our strategic initiatives in the region. And in that sense, this was very frustrating. It seemed to reflect a very rushed and reckless action.
In addition to what my colleagues have said, as we look forward, one of the things that concern me as well is that looking at the new race to a nuclear weapon for Iran and the fact that the president has said he will not let that happen, when asked whether or not they would come back to us before taking action going forward, they weren't willing to answer that. So what is the threshold? What happens when the intelligence says that Iran is within 6 months or 3 months of a nuclear weapon, and they then choose to take action? Does that require congressional consent? I would argue yes, it does. And we had no indication at all from them that they might feel they needed to come to Congress to get support for that action. It was deeply concerning today.
The last thing I would say is I think we all know that Iran and Soleimani's strategic objective in Iraq has all along been to push out the United States and reduce our influence in Iraq. They've been very open about that for years. And our strike, what we did, actually is allowing Iran and Soleimani in death, not in life, to be able to accomplish that objective because we've already seen actions calling for the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces. There is no doubt that our position in Iraq today is weaker than it was before. And I think we are all seeing the result of that right now.
Can you explain why it seems like Republicans had a totally different briefing, that they seem convinced that there was this?
They'll have to explain to you that.
The House is voting tomorrow on a war powers resolution introduced by Democratic Representative Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan. The measure calls for the president.
You had people who gave absolute, crystal clear information that the president and the national security people had when they made the decision to take out Soleimani. What you come away with after listening to the Democrats question these people is there is so much hate and vitriol and animosity against this president that they are willing to put at risk lives of American citizens and American military people. After listening to the information that the president had, the CIA had, the security people had, the people who do intelligence work had, it would have been negligent, it would have been reckless, and it would have been an intentional disregard for the safety of Americans for the president not to act and not to take out Soleimani. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your service. Thank you, sir. I'll go forward to what I get. Oh, moving dog. Here we go.
About 5 seconds.
Yep. How did you feel after?
I came away from this briefing, I don't know what my colleagues have said, I came away from this briefing really angry, deeply dissatisfied that after waiting this long for the facts that justified the killing of the second in command of a foreign government, that the answers were unacceptably vague and unspecific. In fact, my takeaway from this briefing was that it raised more questions than it answered. I have more questions now than I did before I went into this briefing. And frankly, I'm hopeful that the situation is de-escalating, but in some ways I'm more frightened about this situation than I was before.
What was so vague and unimpressive about it?
The same question was asked multiple times and the same answer given.
What was the question?
But that question was essentially unanswered. And I can't go into what, as you well know, I can't go into what the questions were and what the answers were. I can tell you that I would not have accepted this kind of briefing if I had been a state official, as I was for many years, and I were appearing before a judge in our court.
Why do you think all the Republicans have all come out here and said it was a great briefing, they learned a lot? Senator Rich said it was one of the best briefings he's ever had since he's been in Congress. Why such the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on this? Why do you think?
My fear is that our national security has fallen victim to the polarization that we've seen on so many issues. But my hope is that we can come together on a path that de-escalates the potential military confrontation that we saw building over these last few days.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Suppose you two feel differently.
Not sure what he said. I'll tell you how I feel, and then Senator Paul is going to share how he feels. We just left a briefing, and we were talking about Iran. I want to state at the outset, I support President Trump. I support and respect the manner in which he has approached his commander-in-chief powers. I believe that more than any other president in my lifetime, President Trump has shown a lot of restraint. He's been reluctant to get us involved in wars all over the globe. He's been very mindful and respectful of the fact that when the American people are asked to give up blood and treasure, they're sending off their sons and their daughters, their moms and their dads into battlefield. And he's therefore very careful about it. I respect that enormously. My comments at the moment are not directed toward the attack that occurred on Friday. We'll leave that to another day. I will say that we were brought into this briefing today to talk to us about that attack on Friday. I had hoped and expected to receive more information outlining the legal, factual, and moral justification for the attack. I was left somewhat unsatisfied on that front. The briefing lasted only 75 minutes, whereupon our briefers left. This, however, is not the biggest problem I have with the briefing, which I would add was probably the worst briefing I've seen, at least on a military issue, in the 9 years I've served in the United States Senate. What I found so distressing about that briefing was that one of the messages we received from the briefers was, do not debate, do not discuss the issue of the appropriateness of further military intervention against Iran. And that if you do, you'll be emboldening Iran. The implication being that we would somehow be making America less safe by having a debate or a discussion about the appropriateness of further military involvement against the government of Iran. Now, I find this insulting and demeaning, not personally, but to the office that each of the 100 senators in this building happens to hold. I find it insulting and I find it demeaning to the Constitution of the United States, to which we've all sworn an oath. It is, after all, the prerogative of the legislative branch to declare war. Article 1, Section 8 makes that very clear. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 69 made clear that this was a sharp contrast from the form of government that we had prior to the Revolution, a form of government in which the executive, the king, had the power to take us to war. He did not need the Parliament to weigh in on it, to support it. That was the Parliament's job after the fact, after we had gone into war. This, Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, is exactly the reason why this power was put in Article 1, Section 8, in the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. When we send our brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into harm's way, we owe the American people the decent courtesy to follow the Constitution, to debate and discuss these actions. For them to tell us that either through a War Powers Act resolution or otherwise, for us to debate and discuss these things on the Senate floor would somehow weaken the American cause and embolden Iran in any other actions, I find very insulting. Now look, I hope that they'll come back and they'll say, no, you misunderstood us. We didn't say that at all. I wish I could believe that. I will note that when those words were uttered, not one of the briefers stood in objection. Not one of the briefers pushed back on that and said, we want to make clear that this is still the constitutional prerogative of Congress. I also want to make clear that I walked into that briefing undecided as to whether to support the resolution under the War Powers Act introduced by Senator Kaine. Now, Senator Kaine and I have had some discussions. I've got some concerns with some of the language, particularly in some of the whereas clauses that he's introduced. He's agreed to make some changes. And I can say that after that briefing is what changed my mind. That briefing is what brought me on board, together with the amendments that Senator Kaine has agreed to make. I'm now going to support it. I walked into the briefing undecided. I walked out decided, specifically because of what happened in that briefing. It is not acceptable for officials within the executive branch of government, I don't care whether they're with the CIA, with the Department of Defense, or otherwise, to come in and tell us that we can't debate and discuss the appropriateness of military intervention against Iran. It's un-American, it's unconstitutional, and it's wrong. And I hope and expect that they will show greater deference to their own limited power in the future, and to the power that belongs to Congress. This is not about us, it's not about any one of us. This is about our fidelity to those we represent. These powers are not ours. They don't belong to any of us. But when we allow them to be exercised through the wrong branches of government, with the wrong process, when you don't have debate and discussion, you don't allow the process itself to correct itself for the American people who will be most affected by these decisions to weigh in. That was insulting. That was demeaning to the process ordained by the Constitution, and I find it completely unacceptable. On that basis, I've decided to support Senator Kane's resolution, subject to the minor amendments that he and I discussed earlier today. Senator Paul.
Thank you. I joined Senator Lee in making the decision to also support the War Powers resolution. I wanted to hear the intelligence first. What I hear was less than satisfying, but one of the arguments that's been bandied about in public I think is particularly insulting to logic, the Constitution, and the intent of our founding fathers. The argument has been made that the use of authorization of force voted on in 2002 to go to war with Saddam Hussein and his government is justification for anything they want to do in Iraq today, including killing an Iranian general. I see no way in the world you could logically argue that an authorization to have war with Saddam Hussein has anything to do with having war with people currently in Iraq. I think we need to have a debate about the separation of powers. I too am a supporter of the president. I consider myself to be a friend of the president. I think the president's instincts on trying to show restraint and keep us out of war are good. I frankly think he will not unnecessarily escalate things. However, the debate is bigger than just this debate. The debate is a 70-year-long debate that began in 1950 with Korea and Truman. This is a debate, and many have written that Congress has abdicated their duty. Today, this is Senator Lee and I stepping up and saying we are not abdicating our duty. Our duty under the Constitution is for us to debate when we go to war, and we, for one, are not going to abdicate that duty. We'll be happy to take questions.
I know there's very little you can say about the details, but could you give us a better sense of who exactly was saying this to you, that you should debate this? Was it all of them? Was it a specific cabinet member or agency director?
You know, before I comment on that publicly, I'd really like to have a conversation with the president so I can make him aware of what we were told and by whom. But I will say that the messages we received didn't get any pushback internally from the briefers. What we were told over and over again was, look, this action was necessary. This was a bad guy. We had to do it, and we can't have division. We can't have dissension within our ranks, within our government, or else it sends the wrong signal to the Iranians. And I think that's completely wrong. They were asked repeatedly, what, if anything, would trigger the need for the administration to come back to Congress for a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force. At one point, I believe one of the briefers said something along the lines of, I'm sure we could think of something. But they struggled to identify anything. They were asked specifically, well, what about if you concluded, well, it's not my point to get into that here. I don't want to accidentally say anything classified. My point is, they were asked a number of hypotheticals about situations in which they might have to appropriately come and ask for authorization for Congress. Not once did they say, yes, we'd need to do it in that circumstance. At one point, one of the briefers said something like, don't worry, we'll consult you. Well, with history as our guide, consultation isn't necessarily the same thing as authorization for the use of military force. A declaration of war or an AUMF is what the Constitution requires, and drive-by notification or after-the-fact lame briefings like the one we just received aren't adequate.
Do you think the president should have carried out this attack against Soleimani?
Look, I'm still agnostic as to that, Manu. I still haven't had the questions answered that I came into that briefing expecting to ask. They left after 75 minutes. Now, I understand these are busy people. They've got a lot of demands on their time. They're appearing before a coordinate branch of government responsible for their funding, for their confirmation, for any approval of any military action they might undertake. And they had to leave after 75 minutes while they're in the process of telling us that we need to be good little boys and girls and run along and not debate this in public. I find that absolutely insane. I think it's unacceptable. And so I don't know what they had in mind. I went in there hoping to get more specifics as far as the factual, legal, moral justification for what they did. I'm still undecided on that issue, in part because we never got to the details. Every time we got close, they'd say, well, we can't discuss that here because it's really sensitive. We're in a skiff. We're in a secure underground bunker where all electronic devices have to be checked at the door, and they still refuse to tell us. I find that really upsetting.
Did you get a sense that they were not taking it seriously, almost like they didn't want to be there?
No, look, the fact that they were here shows they were taking it seriously. But some of the underlying questions did not appear to be taken seriously by some of them in some of what they told us.
Who did most of the talking on their side? Was it mostly Secretary Pompeo?
No, I would say there was, the time was pretty evenly distributed between the briefers.
So Pompeo is a former member of the House. Do you think he no longer respects members of Congress?
I'm not going to speak as to the subjective mindset of any of the briefers, as to whether they respect us or not. I know only that I came in there with a lot of questions, and that when I left, those questions remained unanswered. And I walked out of there not only without answers to all the questions that I had, but having been told that we shouldn't debate this too much because it might be harmful.
Have either of you read the House Democratic War Powers resolution that's going to be brought up for a vote tomorrow?
I haven't read that. I've read Senator Kane's resolution.
Welcome the debate, at least, if they send something over.
Sure. Look, after today, every time they pull a stunt like this, I'm willing to consider and introduce any and every War Powers Act resolution.
Senator Paul, you mentioned that they used the justification of the Iraq AUMF. So if they were they basically arguing that because the strike took place on Iraqi soil that covered
I don't want to discuss anything they said in there. The only reason I mention that is it's been in the newspaper also. I think it was Blair, the National Security Advisor, argues that 2002, the authorization to go to war with Saddam Hussein authorizes them to do whatever they want. So they have justified the killing of an Iranian general as being something that Congress gave them permission to do in 2002. That is absurd. That's an insult. And every time someone writes that Congress needs to take back their authority on war, that's what we're here to do. Let's have the debate, and let's have some senators stand up, and let's see if we can really, truly have a debate over who has the power to declare war. The reason it was put in and why every founding father said they were taking power away from the president is because they didn't want perpetual war. The president says he doesn't want endless war. Well, the way you have less war is by having less troops in the Middle East and also by having a more fulsome debate about when we go to war.
Is the president being ill-served by this national security team?
I'm not prepared to say that. I'm telling you only this administration was ill-served by this briefing today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.